At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning on June 12, 1962, a prison guard walked down a narrow corridor inside one of the most secure prisons in America. He was doing something he had done thousands of times before. Checking the prisoners. One cell. Then another. Then another. Everything looked normal. The prisoners were still in bed. But when the guard reached one particular cell, something felt strange. The prisoner inside didn't move. The guard called his name. Nothing. He stepped closer. The man still didn't move. So the guard reached through the bars and touched his head. The head rolled off the pillow. It wasn't a human head. It was a fake. And suddenly, the truth became clear. 3 prisoners. 3 beds. 3 fake heads. And 3 men had disappeared from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin. They had vanished from a prison that was supposed to be impossible to escape from. But where had they gone? Were they already dead? Lying somewhere beneath the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay? Or had they actually done the impossible? Had 3 prisoners escaped from Alcatraz and disappeared forever? To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the place they were trying to escape from. Alcatraz Island sits in the middle of San Francisco Bay. From a distance, it doesn't look particularly terrifying. It is just a small island surrounded by water. But in 1962, that island was home to America's most notorious federal prison, Alcatraz, the Rock. A place where the government sent prisoners who were considered too dangerous, too violent, or too difficult to control in ordinary prisons. The prison was surrounded by cold, deep water. The currents around the island were powerful. The water temperature was dangerously low. And the distance to the mainland was more than a mile. Even if a prisoner somehow managed to break out of his cell, he still had to survive the bay. The prison authorities believed this was the ultimate security system. The walls could be climbed. The doors could be opened. But the ocean was the final guard. And the ocean never slept. Over the years, prisoners had attempted to escape. Some were caught. Some were shot. Others disappeared into the water. But nobody had ever successfully escaped and remained free. Alcatraz had become famous for one simple reason. It was believed to be escape-proof. And inside that prison was a man who had spent much of his life proving that rules were meant to be broken. His name was Frank Morris. Morris had grown up moving through the American prison system. He was intelligent, quiet, and according to those who knew him, extremely resourceful. He had been arrested for various crimes and had already escaped from other prisons before arriving at Alcatraz. That was important, because Frank Morris wasn't the kind of prisoner who simply accepted his situation. He studied places. He watched people. He noticed routines. He looked for weaknesses. And Alcatraz, although it was designed to be escape-proof, was still built by human beings. And anything built by humans could have weaknesses. Morris eventually found himself living in the cell block alongside another pair of prisoners. 2 brothers, John Anglin, and his younger brother, Clarence Anglin. The Anglin brothers were from Georgia. They had grown up in a large family. As young men, they became involved in crime. They were particularly known for robbing banks. But there was something unusual about the brothers. They were excellent swimmers. As children, they had spent time swimming in the waters around Georgia. And later, according to reports, they had experienced swimming in difficult conditions. That skill would become extremely important. Because eventually, These three men would begin thinking about the one thing that everyone at Alcatraz had been told was impossible: escape. But the men knew they couldn't simply run. There were too many guards, too many locked doors, too many security measures. And even if they reached the outside of the prison, they still had the bay. So they needed a plan. A very clever plan. And they needed something else. Time. For months, the three men studied the prison. They watched the guards. They learned the routines. They observed when the guards walked through the cell blocks. They noticed when the noise inside the prison was loud enough to hide the sound of their work. And eventually, they discovered something that would change everything. Behind the walls of their cells, there was a narrow utility corridor, and the wall separating the prisoners from that corridor wasn't as strong as it appeared. There was an air vent, a small opening, and behind it, a possibility. But there was one enormous problem. The men couldn't simply remove the vent. They needed tools. And they didn't have any. So they did something that sounds almost impossible. They built their own. The prisoners obtained a variety of crude tools. One of the most remarkable devices was reportedly made using the motor from a broken vacuum cleaner. The motor was transformed into a makeshift drill. It wasn't powerful. It wasn't efficient. But it didn't need to be. The men had something much more valuable: patience. Night after night, they worked. Slowly. Quietly. Carefully. They drilled around the ventilation openings. A little at a time. Then they stopped. If a guard came near, they hid everything. If someone heard a noise, they acted normally. The work continued. Day after day. Week after week. Month after month. The hole slowly became larger. But the prisoners had another problem. What would they do once they escaped from the cells? They would still be inside Alcatraz. They needed a way to get out of the prison building. And even if they succeeded, they would need to cross the water. So the plan became much bigger. They needed equipment. They needed tools. They needed a boat. And they needed to hide everything from the guards. Somewhere inside the prison, the three men began collecting raincoats. 1, 2, 3. Then more. Eventually, they had gathered more than 50. And the raincoats became the raw material for something extraordinary. A raft. Imagine the absurdity of the situation. 3 prisoners, locked inside Alcatraz, secretly building a boat. Out of raincoats, they began stitching the material together. They used whatever tools and materials they could find. They sealed the seams. They reinforced the fabric. They worked carefully. Slowly. The raincoats became something that could actually float. The prisoners also created wooden paddles. And eventually, they had built a homemade inflatable raft. It was crude. It was dangerous. But it might work. Now they had a way to cross the water. But there was still one problem. The guards. Every night, guards walked through the prison. They checked the cells. They looked at the prisoners sleeping in their beds. If Morris and the Anglin brothers disappeared, the guards would notice immediately. So the 3 men came up with perhaps the most brilliant part of their entire plan. They would make the guards believe they were still sleeping. The men created fake heads. They used plaster, soap, paint, and other materials. Then they added real human hair. From a distance, in the darkness, the heads looked surprisingly realistic. The plan was simple. When the guards looked through the bars, they would see what appeared to be 3 prisoners sleeping peacefully in their beds. But behind those heads, the beds would be empty. The escape was almost ready. There was just one more thing. They needed to know exactly when to leave, and they needed to know how to get out. One of the men involved in the escape preparations was Alan West. West was in the cell next to Morris. He had helped with the planning. He had helped create the escape route. But on the night they finally made their move, something went wrong. West couldn't get through his opening in time. The passage was not ready. He was trapped. The others had to make a decision. Wait and risk everything, or leave without him. They chose to leave. And on the night of June 11, 1962, the final plan began. The prison was quiet. The guards were making their rounds. Inside their cells, the fake heads waited. And somewhere behind the walls, 3 men were preparing to disappear. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. They climbed through the openings they had spent months creating. They moved into the hidden utility corridor. And from there, they began making their way through the prison. Every second was dangerous. One wrong sound, one unexpected guard, one door that refused to open, and the entire plan could collapse. But somehow, they made it. They reached the roof. Then they moved through the prison grounds. Eventually, they reached the shoreline. And there, in the darkness, was the object they had secretly built. Their homemade raft. For months, they had dreamed about this moment. Now it was real. But the hardest part was still ahead. The ocean. Imagine standing there. You have escaped from Alcatraz. Behind you is the prison. The guards. The walls. Everything you have been running from. In front of you, the black waters of San Francisco Bay. The wind is cold. The water is freezing. The current is moving. You have no engine. No navigation system. No rescue boat waiting for you. Just a homemade raft. And 3 men who are betting their lives on it. Maybe they look toward the lights of San Francisco. Maybe they looked toward the mainland. Maybe they knew that if they turned back, they would spend the rest of their lives in prison. So they pushed the raft into the water. The 3 men climbed aboard and began paddling. Slowly, the lights of Alcatraz began disappearing behind them. The prison that had been their entire world was becoming smaller and smaller, until it was just a dark shape behind them. Then, the 3 men disappeared into the night. The next morning, the guards began their routine. One cell, then another, then another. And that's when they discovered the deception. The prisoners weren't sleeping. The prisoners were gone. The heads were fake. The beds were empty. And suddenly, Alcatraz went into lockdown. The prison was searched. The walls were examined. The escape route was discovered. And then investigators found something that revealed just how elaborate the plan had been. The hidden workshop. The tools. The equipment. The materials. The evidence showed that the men had been planning their escape for months. But now came the most important question. Where were they? The authorities immediately began searching San Francisco Bay. Boats moved through the water. The Coast Guard became involved. The FBI was called in. The search expanded. Investigators looked for anything that could tell them what had happened. And then, they began finding clues. Pieces of material. possible fragments of the escape equipment, a homemade life vest. But there was no sign of the men. No bodies. No confirmed survivors. Nothing. The search continued. And eventually, the official theory began to take shape. Perhaps the men had drowned. The water was extremely cold. The currents were powerful. Their raft was homemade. And they had no guarantee that they could control where it went. Even if they survived the first part of the journey, they still had to reach land and then disappear. It was possible, but it was incredibly difficult. The FBI spent years investigating. They followed leads. They questioned people. They examined evidence. They searched for signs that the men had survived. But nothing could conclusively prove what happened. Then, something strange happened. A photograph appeared. It reportedly showed two men in Brazil who looked remarkably similar to the Anglin brothers. Could they be John and Clarence? The photograph became part of the mystery. Some people believed it was evidence that the brothers had survived. Others believed it was simply a coincidence. The photograph was never accepted as definitive proof. Then another strange piece of evidence appeared. A letter. A letter allegedly written by John Anglin. The letter claimed that the three men had survived the escape. It suggested that Frank Morris had died later, but that the Anglin brothers had remained alive. If the letter was genuine, then the story of Alcatraz would be completely different. But again, there was no conclusive proof. The handwriting was disputed. The story was questioned. And the mystery remained. In 1979, after 17 years of investigation, the FBI officially closed its case. The conclusion was that the men were presumed to have drowned. But the case didn't truly disappear. The U.S. Marshals Service continued to maintain an interest in the three fugitives. And officially, the mystery remains unresolved. Because nobody ever found their bodies. Nobody ever proved they reached the mainland. And nobody ever proved they died. So, what really happened that night? There are two possibilities. The first is simple. The men launched their raft. The current carried them away from their intended destination. The raft failed. The cold water overwhelmed them. And they drowned. The ocean took them and never gave them back. But there is another possibility. Perhaps the raft worked. Perhaps the three men reached land. Maybe someone was waiting for them. Maybe they had arranged help. Maybe they changed their clothes. Maybe they stole a vehicle. Maybe they escaped the country. Maybe they spent the rest of their lives living under false names. Imagine that. One day, you are a prisoner in Alcatraz. The next, you are free. You have disappeared from the world. Your name no longer exists. Your past is gone. You wake up somewhere far away, and nobody knows where you are. Perhaps one of those men lived for decades. Perhaps he had children. Perhaps he had grandchildren. Perhaps his family never knew the truth. Or perhaps he died carrying the greatest secret of his life. The secret of what really happened on that night in June 1962. But there is something else that makes the story so fascinating. Alcatraz was designed to be a prison where nobody could disappear. Every prisoner had a number. Every movement was watched. Every door was locked. Every night, the guards counted the prisoners. And yet, three men found a way to become invisible. They didn't overpower the guards. They didn't shoot their way out. They didn't blow up the walls. They simply outsmarted the system. They used patience. They used deception. They used imagination. They turned raincoats into a boat. They turned a vacuum cleaner motor into a drill. They turned plaster and paint into fake human heads. And then they vanished. Think about that final night. The guards are walking through the cell block. They look into the cells. They see 3 men sleeping. Everything seems normal. But those men aren't there. They are already outside. The prison is behind them. They are standing at the edge of the island. And somewhere in the darkness, a homemade raft is waiting. They push it into the water. They climb aboard and begin paddling. Behind them, Alcatraz. In front of them, the darkness. Maybe they could see the lights of San Francisco. Maybe they could hear the distant sound of the city. Perhaps they believed freedom was only a few hours away. But the water between them and freedom was cold, dark, and unforgiving. Every stroke of the paddle took them farther from the prison. But it also took them deeper into uncertainty. If the raft failed, they would die. If the guards found them, they would go back to prison. If the current carried them in the wrong direction, they could disappear forever. So they kept paddling. And somewhere during that journey, the story ends. No one knows exactly where. No one knows exactly when. No one knows exactly how. The lights of Alcatraz disappeared behind them. The night became darker. And eventually, nothing. The 3 men were gone. More than 60 years later. We still don't have a definitive answer. Did they drown? Or did they escape? Was the photograph from Brazil proof? Was the letter genuine? Did the Anglin brothers really survive? Did Frank Morris survive? Or did the ocean quietly bury the truth? Maybe someday someone will discover a hidden photograph, a forgotten document, a confession, a family secret, something that finally tells us what happened. Until then, the escape remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of American prisons. Because the story began with a prison that was supposed to be impossible to escape from, and ended with 3 men who simply disappeared. No dramatic arrest. No bodies. No final confession. Just 3 empty beds. 3 fake heads. And a homemade raft that vanished into the darkness. And perhaps that is what makes the story so terrifying. Because when you think about Alcatraz, you think about the prison, the walls, the guards, the locks, the island. But maybe the real mystery isn't how they escaped. Maybe the real mystery is what happened after they disappeared. Somewhere out there. Perhaps the answer has been waiting for more than 60 years. Perhaps the truth is buried beneath the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. Or perhaps 3 men really did paddle away from Alcatraz that night, reached the other side, and walked quietly into the world. And if that's what happened, then somewhere, at some point, 3 prisoners looked back at the rock. One final time. They saw the prison that was supposed to hold them forever. They turned away. And they disappeared. Forever.